Hi guys, I'm Mrs. Harbaugh and this is your lesson number 3, Space and Composition. I'm going to give you some advice, some general information on space and composition in an artwork, and I'm going to give you some of my rules to creating better art. So basically, I want to introduce you to some vocabulary words. I want you to talk about composition. We're going to talk about how using space can help you improve your art. I'm going to show you some examples of successful art. And this week, you're going to reflect on your own art in a writing assignment, and we're going to talk about this week's assignments. Those are the standards that we're using. We're going to be judging art. We're going to be finding the meaning of art, and I'm going to be giving you some techniques. And we are using goals 1, 3, and 4 this week. We're developing creativity, we're learning new techniques, and I'm teaching you how to critique art as you are creating it. Okay, so here's some of the vocabulary that we're going to talk about today. Composition refers to the organization, arrangement, and combination of objects within the borders of drawing space. We are talking about focal points, overlapping, positive and negative space, lines, balance, and we're going to talk about the 5-minute rule, which is one of my rules for success. Okay, so space. When I talk about space in an artwork, what I am talking about is positive and negative space. Positive space is usually the area that your subject takes up. Negative space is the area around it, the background. So you can have different kind of compositions, different kind of levels of positive and negative space. So over here you can see my pictures. This is an example of balanced. You have equal positive space, which is the black, and negative space, which is the white. The second picture is mostly negative space. You have a big wide background here with not much in it, and a small area of positive space. And then down here you have mostly positive space. It's really zoomed in on the subject. There's not that much negative space or background. So positive space is best described as the areas in a work of art that are the subjects or the areas of interest. Negative space is area around the subjects or areas of interest. So think background and subject. Okay, so my first rule for creating better art is using your whole paper. This is something that I've decided to make a rule over years and years of grading my students' artwork. A lot of you don't use enough of your paper. So I think it's having something to do with the fact that you're intimidated by creating a bigger drawing, or it's just something that you're in the habit of doing. Maybe you're used to not wasting paper. Maybe it's just, I'm not sure what it is. But the reason that I don't like when you guys do this, you're drawing your subject very, very, very small on your piece of paper is, number one, it's hard to fill in the other space. A lot of you guys don't create backgrounds. You don't include that in your artwork because you just don't know what to do with this giant amount of space. The second reason, it's difficult to add detail. If your apple, so this apple here that this person's trying to draw is very tiny. If you mess up and you're trying to erase it, it's really difficult to work that small. And also it wastes paper. So you have one little drawing on this giant piece of paper. It's going to be more difficult. It's going to be harder for you to create what you need to create. It's just a better idea to make it bigger. For example, something like this. So this way of drawing, if the same exact picture was just a little bit bigger, took up more of your page, it's more interesting and impactful. It's easier to add detail. It's easier to erase and fix mistakes. It's just all over a little bit better and a little bit easier for you to create art if you're using more positive space or balancing it. So, exceptions to rule number 1. The first exception to rule number 1 is practicing. I want you guys to practice. I want you guys to practice over and over again for something that you're trying to get right. So just like we did with a blind contour drawing in drawing 1, or we did with a lot of times we do this in drawing and design too. We practice, hands or something. If you are trying to figure out how to draw something like a hand, like an apple, whatever, I would like you to overlap your little practice drawings on one piece of paper. This fills up your whole paper. You can make your drawings small. You kind of work your kinks out. You kind of work out all of the issues, the little hangups that you might have in the future by practicing it first. You're not wasting paper. You can get ready for a finished drawing, and you don't need as much detail, so you don't have to worry about it being really small. So that's my exception number 1. My exception number 2 to this rule number 1 is if you're doing it on purpose. So a lot of negative space can communicate a mood. So in this one, this artist was trying to communicate isolation. There's a lot of negative space. All you see is this one man in his shadow, and it's trying to communicate loneliness or isolation. If you're making a stylistic decision with that, you're trying to say something with it, absolutely. Please have more negative space. You can make your drawing smaller. But most of the time, I want you to take up as much positive space as you possibly can. Okay, so what is composition? Composition refers to the organization, arrangement, and combination of objects within borders of a drawing space. It's a way of bringing the eyes of the viewer, the person that's looking at your art, toward your center of interest and making it just generally look good. My Mrs. Harbaugh definition for composition is the way that things are just generally positioned and arranged that makes your drawing look better. So a couple of different elements of composition. I'll explain them, and these are not by any means all things that you all have to do or not have to do. These are just suggestions, things to look out for. So you can have a symmetrical composition, equal on both sides, or you can have an asymmetrical composition. This is not the same on both sides, and by doing that, it suggests movement. So if you have a symmetrical composition, it feels stable. If you have an asymmetrical composition, it usually is trying to communicate movement or something else. Another element of composition or something to think about is numbers of things. A lot of times if you just have 2 things in your drawing, people don't know what to look at. If you have an odd number or you arrange them in a way where there's a focal point like this one, it's a little bit more interesting looking. Just little tricks that people have picked up along the way. Placing things is also a way that you can make your compositions better. So varying the space between the elements of your composition, angles and sizes can make it more interesting. This is the element of art or the principle of design, variety. So elements must either be definitely apart or definitely overlapped. If you have them just touching, it kind of distracts what you're supposed to be looking at. So overlapping helps, just touching. It's one of those things where the viewer will look at it and it will feel awkward to them, but they probably can't put it into words. So you can create unity and variety by repeating shapes, lines, textures, and values. So that's just a little example of placing things. Like I said, totally apart or overlapped. Try to avoid this one. Here's an example of how you can overlap things. Let's just say we have a random arrangement of things on a table. It usually unifies a drawing. It gives you a sense of depth. You feel like it goes back. It has a 3D element to it, and it just generally looks good. This is called a zigzag composition because it kind of looks like a zigzag. You're looking at this first, then this, then that, into that on the table. Another thing I want you to think about with composition is having all 3 grounds. So foreground, middle ground, background. That first picture I showed you with the apple, when we were talking about making things bigger or smaller, that didn't have any middle ground or background. It was good for a practice, but not for a finished drawing. So you want to make sure that you have something in the back, something in the middle, and something in front. That gives your drawing depth and perspective. We will have a whole unit on perspective later on in Drawing and Design 1, and then we're going to reinforce it in Drawing and Design 2. It adds depth, it adds realism, it adds just a little bit more to your drawings and designs than not including a background. And if for those people that like rules, well, there's not a whole lot of rules in art, but for those of my students that like a formula, a step-by-step process, perspective, you will probably like, because you just do have to follow a certain number of steps. And then something that I'm going to talk about a lot is your focal point. So what's the star of your show? Most compositions have one or maybe two main subjects that are the focal points of the image. So let's say it's a portrait. Maybe you want to look at the person's eyes. Maybe it's a still life. Maybe there's one thing in your still life, that like a wine bottle or something that has a lot of reflection, and that's what you want people to look at first. The thing that you're most excited to draw, the star of your show. So in order to make the star of your show really shine, there's certain placements, there's certain things that we want to do to really show it off. So the viewer needs something to look at first. You might not realize this, but your center of focus or your focal point is always better a little bit off center. And there's a rule called the rule of thirds, magic thirds, that really, really helps you put your focal point in the right place. A lot of you guys are doing this already. You just didn't realize that there was a science behind it. So if you divide your canvas or your piece of paper into thirds, horizontally and vertically, they say that in order to create the most effective compositions, you should be placing it either 1/3 across, so here, this thicker line, or 1/3 up from the picture, or anywhere where these lines intersect, where these red lines are. So an example of this is, for instance, this painting by Salvador Dali, which is called Persistence of Memory. You can see he probably wants us to look at this melting clock first, and then this one second. It's at this line, and then what we're looking at after that is on the one line up. So one line across and one line up, and then you've got these points where they intersect. That's where he's created everything. You can see he's created everything within the rule of thirds. This is Jan Vermeer's The Milkmaid. It's pretty interesting. It looks like a pretty basic drawing to us, or painting to us. You can see that what he probably wants us to look at is the hands and the pitcher of milk, because it's on the first third across, and if we're in the first one up. So everything exists kind of in this rule of thirds. A lot of times too, they will leave one section, one row or column, if you were to separate this like that, empty. So this 1/3 of the drawing over here is left pretty empty. So we're supposed to focus on where the weight of the drawing is, which is over here. And you can see that the focal point is off center, just like we talked about. Here's another example. You have Hokusai's The Great Wave. You've probably seen this before. It's pretty famous in art history. But the focal point, and try to guess it before I say it, but the focal point is the wave, right? That's on the first third across. And most of the bulk of the drawing is within the bottom third. A lot of artists do this already. It's just kind of this unspoken thing in your head that gives you that special eye in art. And a lot of you are probably putting things on the first and the first third all the time. You just didn't put a name to it. But if you didn't know that, and if you're not doing that, this is a pretty good thing to think about. Okay, so my second rule. Okay, so my second rule with composition is I want you to make a plan. So the first thing that you're going to do is make your drawing take up more of the paper. Then I want you to think about composition. There's a lot of different ways you can go with that, so I can't make that a concrete rule. But I do want you to think about your drawings before you start them. A lot of times we just go for it and we end up throwing it away or ripping it up because we don't like it. If we make a plan before we really get rolling, it'll be better. So something I talk about a lot is successful art is just problem solving. Drawing is a lot of adjusting, it's tweaking, it's taking a step back, it's looking at it with different eyes. If you take time to plan your drawing and take time to visualize what you're trying to do before you start, you're going to have an easier time. The worst thing that I find that you guys do, and we talked about this with lesson 1 with mindset, is things aren't going very well for you in the middle of your drawing. You're like, oh man, this is terrible. I'm not doing a good job at this, and you throw it away. I get that. I felt that frustration before too. But a lot of times you think it's you. You think, I'm not good at this. When in reality, there's practical steps. Making a plan is going to make a really big difference. So here's something that I tried to do. For my fine art class, I did a painting, a still life painting. And I just happened to, at this one time, take pictures of my thought process. You know, what was going to work, what's not going to work. My initial thought was, okay, I want to do these really pretty teacups that I have in my cupboard. But I got a couple objects out and I thought, you know, that's kind of, I might want more color than that. And that looks really complicated to try to do in a painting. So I didn't know what to do. I set them to the side and I tried to find some other things. Then I came up with this. I had some peaches, I had some teacups, and I had a teapot. But something wasn't quite sitting right for me. It just seemed too blah. So I was playing around with it a little bit. I liked the colors kind of, but I just couldn't figure out what to do from there. And then I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll go with an analogous color scheme. Remember, we talked about colors with the elements and principles of art lesson. So I thought, okay, blue, tealish, and yellow, maybe that works. I kind of like that idea, but something still felt off to me. And then after kind of thinking about the composition of it, I was like, I think I need something taller. It's awkward to me that the teacups and the teapot are the same height. And if I were to paint this as a painting, it would look too flat. So what should I do? I played around with the lighting. In this class, I'll talk a lot about altering your lighting. It's hard to paint shadows that you can't see. So often what I do is I will take the lampshade off of a lamp, and then it creates harsher shadows. Now I can see the shadows that I'm trying to draw. And I got something a little bit taller. I got this vase. So I thought, okay, that's good. But then I thought, I need something even taller, and I want to bring that other color in. So this took like an afternoon. This of planning and playing with things and closing one eye and visualizing and doing a 30-second sketch really quick. This is what I came up with. I actually went out to the grocery store to get flowers because I thought I need some more height. Okay, I thought I'm going to go for a symmetrical composition too. So this was my plan. And then when I sketched it out, I did the 5-minute rule, which is a different part of the lesson. But when I sketched it out, I realized there's no way that with my canvas, I'm going to fit 2 teacups and 2 lemons and that tray. So I decided to make it a symmetrical composition, take out half of my items, and just focus on what I have right here. So this was the finished result. It's interesting because you can see that my focal point is this flower right here, and I've put it in the first, I've put it within the rule of thirds. If I were to divide this into 3, it would fall on this line, and it would be on this line. So it's a little bit off center, but it follows the rule of thirds. And I also used color, contrast, shading to emphasize my focal point. Therefore, if art is more about creative problem solving, working through some of those problems before you start is where you're going to get a lot of your success. Okay, along with composition, a lot of times what I talk about is the 5-minute rule. I want you to complete your entire drawing, a rough sketch of your entire drawing before you really start to draw. That sounds confusing, but I'll explain what I mean. So I want you to think of your drawing as a blurry picture at first. I don't want you to think of a lot of times what you guys do, and I know that a lot of you can relate to this because students every year relate to this, but have you ever been drawing and you are making this beautiful sketch of a tree. Let's just say you're drawing a tree. And you start from left to right or right to left, and you start on your favorite part, and you're drawing leaves. So you're just leaf, leaf, leaf. And you're really, really perfecting these leaves and outlining them, or you're working on this, and then you keep drawing, and you realize my tree doesn't fit on my piece of paper. And then you have to throw it away, and you spent forever agonizing over a small detail. So this is actually something I never learned in high school. I learned this in a college art class, and it changed my life. So you should take the first 5 minutes of every time you're drawing something to draw your whole thing really, really, really loose and messy. Because it's good to think of all drawings like a camera out of focus, and instead of you drawing details to start, you are drawing sloppy, and then you're slowly focusing the camera. You're slowly adding details, or as an art professor of mine once said, information. If art is a communication, you're adding more and more information to communicate what you're trying to communicate. So if you map out your drawing before you really start and say, oh, no, I think I want to move that. I think I want to make this taller. It's part of making a plan, but you could make some adjustments before you're in the middle of it, and then you realize you have to make an adjustment. Okay, to sum up your lesson 3 video, we should be using our whole paper. You should be thinking about different elements of composition, and don't worry, we'll go over this in class. You should be making a plan, and you should be mapping out your drawing in the first 5 minutes of working on something.